I never thought watching my sister Rachel parade around our family Christmas dinner with my ex-boyfriend David would lead to the most satisfying moment of my entire life. But when 3 FBI agents knocked on our parents' door during dessert, and David pulled out his badge while looking directly at Rachel's horrified face, I realized that sometimes karma has a sense of humor that's absolutely perfect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter December wind whipped through the bare oak trees, lining Maple Street as I pulled into my parents' driveway in Millbrook, Ohio, mentally preparing myself for what I knew would be the most awkward Christmas Eve dinner of my 28 years. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my modest Honda Civic as I stared at the familiar 2-story colonial house where I'd grown up, its windows glowing warmly with the soft light of Mom's carefully arranged holiday decorations. What should have been a comforting sight of home and family tradition instead filled me with dread, because I knew that inside, my older sister Rachel would be waiting with her latest trophy, my former boyfriend David Chen. My name is Emma Sullivan, and 6 months ago I thought I had my life figured out. I was working as a digital marketing consultant in Cincinnati, building a steady client base, and finally feeling confident about my career trajectory. David and I had been dating for almost 2 years, and while our relationship wasn't passionate or dramatic, it felt stable and comfortable in a way that seemed perfect for building a future together. He worked as what he called a business consultant, traveling frequently, but always making time for quiet dinners and weekend movies when he was in town. Our relationship was the kind that my practical mind appreciated, built on mutual respect, and shared values rather than intense romance or flashy gestures. That practical approach to love had always set me apart from my sister Rachel, who seemed to collect relationships and experiences like trophies, each one more impressive than the last. At 31, Rachel had built what appeared to be a wildly successful event planning business called Elegance Events, specializing in high-end weddings and corporate gatherings that regularly made the society pages of Columbus magazines. Her social media presence was a carefully curated showcase of designer clothes, luxury vacations, and exclusive parties that made her life look like something from a lifestyle blog. Where I chose sensible apartments and reliable cars, Rachel lived in a stunning downtown loft and drove a BMW that cost more than I made in 6 months. The contrast between us had always been stark, but it had never felt competitive until the spring afternoon when Rachel called me with news that would shatter my comfortable assumptions about my life and relationships. She had met David at a networking event in Columbus, she explained with barely contained excitement, and they had connected immediately over their shared interest in business strategy and travel. What started as professional conversation had evolved into something more personal, and Rachel wanted me to know before I heard it from someone else that she and David were exploring a romantic relationship. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it contained enough carefully chosen words and strategic pauses to make Rachel's message crystal clear. David had chosen her over me, attracted by her sophistication and success in ways that my quiet stability could never match. She was sorry if this caused me any pain, Rachel assured me, but she couldn't ignore such a strong connection simply because David and I had dated. Real love, she implied, was rare and shouldn't be sacrificed for sisterly convenience, especially when my relationship with David had been more comfortable than passionate anyway. The breakup itself was handled with the kind of gentle efficiency that David brought to most situations. He appeared at my apartment the following weekend with coffee from our usual cafe and an expression of genuine regret that made the conversation even more painful than anger would have been. Our relationship had been wonderful, he assured me, but he had realized that wonderful wasn't enough for the kind of future he wanted to build. His connection with Rachel represented something deeper and more exciting than what we had shared, and he hoped I would understand that ending things now was kinder than continuing a relationship that had reached its natural conclusion. I listened to his explanation with the same practical acceptance that had characterized our entire relationship. nodding at appropriate moments and asking the kind of clarifying questions that demonstrated my maturity and understanding. Inside, however, I felt something more complex than simple heartbreak. David's choice of Rachel over me confirmed every insecurity I'd ever had about my own appeal and worth, reinforcing the narrative that had followed me through our entire childhood, about which Sullivan's sister was more interesting, more successful, more worthy of attention and admiration. The months that followed were filled with social media updates that documented Rachel and David's rapidly developing relationship with the kind of public enthusiasm that felt deliberately designed to showcase their happiness to the widest possible audience. Photos from weekend trips to Chicago and Nashville appeared regularly on Rachel's Instagram, always featuring David looking more relaxed and spontaneous than I'd ever seen him during our 2 years together. Their relationship seemed to bring out aspects of his personality that had remained hidden during our time together, as if Rachel's vibrant energy had unlocked some more adventurous version of the man I thought I knew. Rachel's approach to displaying their relationship felt particularly pointed during family gatherings, where she would reference their shared experiences and inside jokes with the casual confidence of someone who wanted everyone to understand that her connection with David was deeper and more meaningful than whatever I had previously shared with him. Her stories about their travels and adventures were delivered with genuine enthusiasm, but they also carried an undertone of comparison that made it clear she considered their relationship a significant upgrade from David's previous romantic choices. The announcement that Rachel and David would be attending Christmas Eve dinner together had arrived in a group text to the family 3 weeks before the holiday, presented as wonderful news that everyone should be excited to celebrate. Mom and Dad had responded with appropriate enthusiasm, while I had stared at my phone for several minutes trying to formulate a response that would demonstrate both sisterly support and personal emotional health. The prospect of watching Rachel and David exchange meaningful glances and casual touches across our family dinner table filled me with a mixture of dread and resigned acceptance that this was simply my new reality. My parents, Linda and Tom Sullivan, had handled the delicate family dynamics with the kind of diplomatic approach they'd perfected during 35 years of marriage and child-rearing. Mom had called me privately to express concern about how I was handling the situation, offering to make alternative arrangements if spending Christmas with Rachel and David felt too difficult. Her voice carried the kind of careful neutrality that parents develop when navigating conflicts between adult children, clearly wanting to support me without taking sides in a situation that had no clear villain or obvious solution. Dad's approach had been characteristically direct, asking during one of our weekly phone calls whether I was genuinely okay with the Christmas arrangements or simply being polite about an impossible situation. His concern was touching, but it also highlighted the fundamental challenge of family gatherings that include former romantic partners and current couples. The dynamics were inherently awkward, regardless of everyone's best intentions and efforts to maintain normal holiday traditions. Rachel's daughter, Sophie, now 17 and possessing her mother's sharp observational skills along with the teenagers' impatience with adult drama, had texted me directly to express her opinion that the whole situation was unnecessarily complicated and that adults should be better at handling relationship changes without making holidays weird for everyone else. Her perspective was refreshingly straightforward, though it also made me realize that our family dynamics were apparently obvious enough for a teenager to identify as problematic. The weeks leading up to Christmas had been filled with careful planning and emotional preparation as I tried to approach the holiday gathering with genuine grace and maturity. I had practiced conversations in my bathroom mirror, rehearsing responses to questions about my own dating life, and preparing gracious comments about Rachel and David's relationship that would demonstrate my complete emotional recovery from their romantic transition. The effort felt exhausting, but it also seemed necessary for maintaining family relationships and avoiding the kind of holiday drama that would overshadow the celebration my parents deserved. My current dating life provided some insulation from questions about my emotional state, though the timing of my new relationship with Mark Williams felt almost too convenient to be entirely coincidental. Mark was a graphic designer I'd met through work, and our connection was developing with the kind of easy compatibility that suggested genuine potential for something meaningful. His presence in my life made it easier to appear completely recovered from David's departure, though I wasn't entirely sure whether my feelings for Mark were authentic or simply a welcome distraction from more complicated emotions. The professional success I'd achieved during the months since David left had also provided a helpful narrative about personal growth and moving forward with confidence. My marketing consultancy had expanded significantly, with several new clients and a waiting list that suggested strong word-of-mouth recommendations. The financial stability and professional recognition felt like evidence that I was thriving independently, building a life that didn't require romantic validation or family approval to be meaningful and successful. As I sat in my car outside my childhood home, watching the warm light spill from the windows where my family was probably already gathering for cocktails and appetizers, I reminded myself that I had survived worse challenges than an awkward holiday dinner. Rachel's happiness with David didn't diminish my own worth or future possibilities, and my ability to handle this situation with grace would demonstrate the kind of emotional maturity that I genuinely wanted to possess. The evening might be uncomfortable, but it was also an opportunity to prove to myself and my family that I could navigate complex relationships with dignity and genuine goodwill. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps, and Mom appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite red holiday sweater and the kind of welcoming smile that had greeted me through countless childhood arrivals. Her embrace was warm and lasted just long enough to convey concern without suggesting that this evening required special emotional support. Behind her, I could hear the familiar sounds of family gathering, voices mixing with soft holiday music and the gentle clink of glasses that indicated Dad had already started serving his famous Christmas punch. Rachel's laughter carried from the living room as Mom led me through the entryway, bright and genuine in a way that suggested she was thoroughly enjoying whatever conversation was taking place. The sound hit me with unexpected force, reminding me of countless holiday memories when that same laughter had been part of sisterly bonding rather than romantic display. The realization that those shared experiences now carried different emotional weight was one of the losses I hadn't fully anticipated when processing the changes in our family dynamics. David's voice joined the conversation as we approached the living room, deeper and more animated than I remembered from our quiet evenings together. His laugh in response to something Rachel had said sounded relaxed and spontaneous, confirming my growing suspicion that their relationship brought out aspects of his personality that had remained dormant during our time together. The evidence that I had perhaps never known the real David felt like a fresh, small heartbreak layered onto the larger loss of our relationship. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The living room scene that greeted me was exactly what I had expected, but somehow more difficult to witness than I had prepared for. Rachel sat curled on the sofa next to David, her hand resting casually on his arm as she gestured during conversation. Both of them looking comfortable and naturally connected in a way that spoke of genuine intimacy rather than performative display. Dad sat in his usual armchair with a drink in hand, clearly enjoying their company, while Sophie sprawled on the floor wrapping last-minute gifts with the kind of focused determination that suggested she was trying to avoid the adult conversation happening around her. The moment of my entrance created a brief pause in conversation as everyone turned to acknowledge my arrival, their expressions carefully arranged to convey welcome without highlighting the potential awkwardness of the situation. Rachel's smile was particularly warm, suggesting either genuine sisterly affection or masterful social performance, while David's greeting carried the kind of friendly warmth that indicated he intended to treat me as a valued family member rather than an ex-girlfriend whose presence might complicate his current relationship. The evening that followed unfolded with the kind of careful choreography that characterizes family gatherings, where everyone is working to maintain harmony despite underlying tensions. Conversation flowed around safe topics like work updates, holiday plans, and shared memories that predated the current romantic complications. Rachel's stories about recent business successes were delivered with enthusiasm, but without the pointed comparisons to my own achievements that I had feared, while David contributed observations about travel and current events that demonstrated his integration into family discussions without overshadowing other voices. Dinner itself provided temporary relief from social navigation as we focused on Mom's traditional Christmas Eve menu and the kind of food-centered conversation that had anchored our family celebrations for as long as I could remember. Rachel's compliments about the meal were generous and specific, acknowledging Mom's cooking skills in ways that felt genuine rather than performative. David's appreciation for the family recipes and holiday traditions suggested either authentic interest or exceptional social skills, though his comfort level with our family dynamics seemed to indicate that his connection to Rachel had extended naturally to include meaningful relationships with our parents. The gift exchange that followed dinner revealed another layer of David's integration into our family traditions, as he presented thoughtfully chosen presents for each family member that demonstrated both attention to their individual preferences and understanding of our family culture. His gift for Dad was a book about local history that sparked immediate conversation, while Mom received a beautiful scarf that she immediately declared perfect for her winter wardrobe. Even Sophie seemed genuinely pleased with the art supplies he had selected based on her interest in graphic design. Rachel's gifts displayed her characteristic flair for dramatic presentation and expensive taste, each one carefully selected to demonstrate both thoughtfulness and financial success. Her present for David was opened with particular ceremony, revealing a vintage watch that clearly represented significant financial investment and personal meaning. His response suggested genuine surprise and appreciation, reinforcing the impression that their relationship operated on a level of emotional intimacy that extended to major gift-giving gestures. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing David with new attention, trying to understand what aspects of his personality had remained hidden during our relationship and what Rachel had discovered that I had missed. His conversation revealed interests in art and politics that we had never explored together, while his interaction style seemed more confident and spontaneous than I remembered. The realization that I might have dated someone for 2 years without truly knowing him felt like a revelation about both his reserve and my own observational limitations. The most striking aspect of David's behavior throughout the evening was his apparent comfort with being the center of positive attention, a quality that had not been evident during our more private relationship. Rachel's obvious pride in presenting him to our family brought out a more charismatic version of his personality, as if her belief in his appeal had given him permission to display qualities that he had previously kept restrained. The transformation was subtle but undeniable, suggesting that their connection operated on psychological levels that had not existed during his relationship with me. By the time we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, the evening had established a new normal for our family dynamics that felt surprisingly sustainable, despite my initial fears about awkwardness and emotional discomfort. Rachel and David's relationship was clearly genuine and serious, but they had managed to include me in conversations and activities without making their romantic connection feel exclusionary or deliberately hurtful. The evening demonstrated that family relationships could evolve to accommodate changed circumstances without sacrificing fundamental bonds of affection and respect. The peaceful conclusion to what I had anticipated as a difficult evening left me feeling both relieved and slightly melancholy about the permanence of the changes in our family structure. Rachel's happiness was evident and seemed to be built on a solid foundation of compatibility with David that would likely result in long-term relationship success. My role as the sister who had gracefully accepted these changes while building her own independent life felt both mature and slightly lonely, though it also represented the kind of emotional growth that I genuinely wanted to achieve. As I prepared to leave for my own apartment, accepting Mom's offer of leftover cookies and Dad's reminder about New Year's plans, I reflected on how the evening had challenged my expectations while confirming others. Rachel and David were clearly building something meaningful together, But the foundation of their happiness didn't require my unhappiness or exclusion from family celebrations. The possibility of maintaining positive relationships with both of them while pursuing my own romantic future felt more realistic after witnessing how naturally they had included me in their shared evening with our parents. What I couldn't have imagined as I drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook was that this peaceful Christmas Eve represented the calm before a storm that would transform everyone's understanding of David, Rachel, and the true nature of the relationship I had been so gracefully accepting. The evening that had ended with such apparent harmony and resolution was actually the final chapter of a much longer story that none of us knew was being written. One that would soon reveal secrets that would change our family dynamics in ways far more dramatic than any simple romantic triangle ever could. The morning after Christmas Eve brought an unexpected phone call that would begin to unravel everything I thought I understood about David's presence in our family. I was still in my pajamas, nursing my second cup of coffee and scrolling through the predictably cheerful holiday posts on social media when my phone buzzed with Rachel's name on the display. Her voice carried an edge of frustration that immediately caught my attention, completely different from the confident happiness she had displayed throughout the previous evening's festivities. David had received some kind of urgent work call. During breakfast, Rachel explained, her tone suggesting this wasn't the first time his professional obligations had interrupted their personal time. He'd apologized profusely, but explained that a critical client situation required his immediate attention, and he would need to spend most of Christmas Day handling what he described as a complex consulting emergency. The timing was terrible, Rachel continued, because they had planned to drive to Columbus together to attend a holiday party hosted by one of her major clients, an event that represented an important networking opportunity for her business. What struck me as odd about Rachel's complaint wasn't her disappointment about the changed plans, which seemed perfectly reasonable, but rather the specific details she mentioned about David's work emergency. In the 2 years I had dated him, David's consulting projects had certainly required travel and occasional weekend work, but I couldn't recall him ever describing any client situation as urgent enough to demand Christmas Day attention. His approach to work had always been methodical and carefully planned, with clear boundaries between professional obligations and personal time that seemed inconsistent with the kind of crisis-driven consulting that would require holiday intervention. Rachel's description of David's demeanor during the phone call also puzzled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. She mentioned that he had stepped outside to take the call, speaking in what she described as an unusually formal tone that was different from his typical business conversations. When he returned to explain the situation, his explanation had been somewhat vague about the specific nature of the client emergency and the type of consulting work that required such immediate attention. Rachel had accepted his explanation without question, but something about the interaction had left her feeling unsettled in ways she couldn't fully explain. The conversation with Rachel lasted nearly an hour, during which she shared details about David's work habits and professional commitments that revealed aspects of his behavior I had never observed during our relationship. According to Rachel, David frequently received phone calls that required him to step away from social situations, always returning with explanations about client needs or project deadlines that seemed reasonable, but were often frustratingly vague about specifics. His travel schedule was more erratic than the steady consulting work he had described to me, with trips that were sometimes extended or modified at short notice due to what he characterized as evolving client requirements. Most intriguingly, Rachel mentioned that David seemed to have an unusual level of knowledge about business regulations, tax compliance, and legal requirements that went beyond what she would expect from a typical management consultant. During their conversations about her event planning business, he had made observations about industry practices and regulatory considerations that demonstrated expertise in areas that seemed tangential to his described consulting focus. When Rachel had asked him about this knowledge, David had explained that modern consulting required broad understanding of multiple business functions, but his answers had sometimes felt more detailed than casual consulting experience would typically provide. The picture that emerged from Rachel's descriptions was of someone whose professional life contained elements that didn't quite align with the straightforward consulting career David had presented during our relationship. The discrepancies weren't dramatic enough to suggest deception, but they were sufficient to create a pattern of small mysteries that made me wonder whether I had ever fully understood what David actually did for work. My own acceptance of his vague descriptions of consulting projects now seemed less like respect for professional privacy and more like a failure to ask the kind of detailed questions that might have revealed important information about his actual career. Rachel's decision to attend the Columbus holiday party alone, despite David's absence, provided me with an unexpected opportunity to observe her social and professional environment without his presence influencing the dynamics. She had initially considered canceling her appearance at the event, but ultimately decided that maintaining her business relationships was too important to sacrifice for personal disappointment. Her description of the party as a networking opportunity with potential clients and industry contacts reminded me of how seriously Rachel approached the social aspects of her business success, treating every gathering as a chance to expand her professional influence. The event itself, as Rachel described it to me in a follow-up call the next day, had been both professionally productive and personally revealing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Several attendees had asked about David, apparently remembering him from previous events where Rachel had introduced him as her boyfriend and business advisor. Their questions about his consulting work had prompted Rachel to realize how little specific information she actually possessed about his professional background, beyond the general descriptions he provided about helping businesses optimize their operations and strategic planning. One conversation in particular had left Rachel feeling puzzled about David's professional credentials and experience. Marcus Webb, a successful business owner who had known Rachel for several years, had expressed interest in potentially hiring David for a consulting project related to operational efficiency and regulatory compliance. When Marcus had asked for specific information about David's background, educational credentials, and previous client experience, Rachel had realized she couldn't provide the kind of detailed professional references that serious business people typically expected when considering consultant recommendations. Marcus's questions had been professional and courteous, but they had highlighted gaps in Rachel's knowledge about David's career that she had never noticed during their months of dating. She couldn't name his previous clients, describe his educational background, or provide specifics about the types of projects he typically handled. When Marcus had asked whether David had experience with businesses in the hospitality and event planning industry, Rachel had been unable to answer with any certainty, realizing that their conversations about her business had been more one-sided than she had previously recognized. The social dynamics at the party had also revealed something else that surprised Rachel, and, when she shared it with me, provided another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to recognize. Several people at the gathering had mentioned seeing David at various business and social events around Columbus over the past year, often in contexts that seemed unrelated to Rachel's social circle or her business connections. These casual references suggested that David maintained a level of independent social and professional activity in Columbus that Rachel hadn't been aware of, despite their regular communication and frequent time together. When Rachel had mentioned these observations to some of the people who claimed to have seen David at other events, their descriptions of his behavior and conversations had been surprisingly consistent. Multiple people remembered him as someone who asked thoughtful questions about business operations, seemed particularly interested in discussions about financial management and regulatory compliance, and demonstrated knowledge about legal and administrative requirements that suggested professional expertise in those areas. These characterizations aligned with Rachel's own observations about David's unusual familiarity with business regulations, but they also suggested that his interest in these topics extended beyond casual conversation or general consulting knowledge. The most intriguing detail from Rachel's evening was a comment made by Jennifer Liu, a successful accountant who specialized in small business financial management and tax preparation. Jennifer had mentioned speaking with David at a previous event about the challenges that growing businesses face in maintaining proper financial records and ensuring compliance with tax obligations. According to Jennifer, David had demonstrated unusually sophisticated understanding of tax law and regulatory requirements, asking questions that suggested professional rather than casual interest in these topics. Jennifer's observation about David's expertise had prompted her to ask whether he had formal training in accounting or tax law, questions that David had deflected with general comments about the importance of understanding financial management in modern consulting work. Jennifer had found his responses evasive and had mentioned to Rachel that David's level of knowledge seemed inconsistent with the broad management consulting background he had described. Her professional instincts had been sufficiently triggered that she had actually looked up David's consulting business online after their conversation, but had been unable to find any professional website or business registration that matched his described services. Rachel's recounting of Jennifer's observations created the first moment of genuine concern about David's professional identity and the accuracy of the information he had shared about his work. The possibility that David had misrepresented his professional background felt shocking given the level of trust and intimacy their relationship had developed, but the accumulating evidence of discrepancies in his explanations was becoming difficult to ignore. Rachel's voice carried a mixture of confusion and worry as she processed the implications of these discoveries, clearly struggling to reconcile her positive personal experience with David against the growing questions about his professional honesty. The conversation with Rachel also prompted me to reflect on my own limited knowledge about David's work and the assumptions I had made about his professional life during our relationship. I realized that I had accepted his general descriptions of consulting work without ever asking for the kind of specific details that would have provided clearer understanding of his actual job responsibilities and career background. My respect for professional privacy had prevented me from pursuing questions that might have revealed important information about his real work, creating a pattern of limited knowledge that now seemed problematic rather than appropriately respectful. The timing of David's Christmas Day work emergency, combined with the questions raised at Rachel's holiday party, created a growing sense that there were aspects of his professional life that neither Rachel nor I fully understood. The pattern of vague explanations, unusual expertise in regulatory matters, and apparent social connections that extended beyond his described consulting work suggested possibilities that ranged from simple privacy preferences to more significant misrepresentations about his career and background. Rachel's decision to investigate David's professional claims more thoroughly represented a significant shift in her approach to their relationship, and her willingness to question aspects of his identity that she had previously accepted without scrutiny. Her plan to search online for more information about his consulting business and professional credentials demonstrated the kind of due diligence that successful business owners naturally applied to new professional relationships, though it felt uncomfortable when directed toward someone she had been dating for several months. The search efforts that Rachel undertook over the following days produced results that were both limited and concerning in ways that neither of us had anticipated. David's online professional presence was surprisingly minimal for someone who claimed to run an active consulting business with no dedicated website, limited social media presence, and no visible client testimonials or case studies that would typically showcase a consultant's work and expertise. The absence of easily discoverable information about his business credentials and previous projects felt unusual in an era when most professional service providers maintained detailed online portfolios and client references. More troubling than the limited online presence was the discovery that no business registration could be found for David's described consulting company, despite Rachel's familiarity with business registration requirements through her own event planning business. The lack of proper business documentation raised questions about the legitimacy of his consulting work and the accuracy of his descriptions about client relationships and project experience. These discoveries transformed Rachel's casual curiosity about David's work into genuine concern about potential deception regarding his professional identity and career background. The investigation process also revealed discrepancies in David's educational background that added another layer of confusion to the growing questions about his honesty and transparency. When Rachel attempted to verify his claimed MBA from Northwestern University through online searches and professional networking sites, she found no record of his graduation or participation in the program during the time period he had specified. The absence of educational verification felt particularly significant, given David's demonstrated knowledge and professional competence, suggesting either alternative educational background or misrepresentation about his academic credentials. Rachel's growing concerns about David's professional honesty prompted her to reach out to mutual acquaintances who might have additional information about his background and career history. These conversations produced conflicting and confusing information that raised more questions than they answered, with some people expressing familiarity with David's consulting work, while others seemed puzzled by descriptions of his business activities. The inconsistent accounts of his professional identity suggested that David might be presenting different versions of his career background to different people, depending on the context and audience. The most disturbing discovery came when Rachel contacted the hotel where David claimed to have conducted a recent consulting project, hoping to verify his professional references and potentially secure a testimonial for his work. The hotel management had no record of engaging David's services or working with any consultant matching his description during the specified time period. When Rachel provided additional details about the project scope and timeline that David had described, the hotel representatives seemed confused by her inquiry and suggested that no such consulting work had been commissioned or completed at their property. This concrete evidence of misrepresentation about specific client work marked a turning point in Rachel's investigation and her relationship with David. The discovery that he had apparently fabricated details about a consulting project, complete, with specific timelines and deliverables, suggested a level of deception that extended far beyond simple privacy about work responsibilities. The realization that she had been dating someone who was willing to lie about his professional activities created a crisis of trust that called into question every aspect of their relationship and David's character. Rachel's emotional response to these discoveries was complex and painful, involving betrayal, confusion, and fear about what other aspects of David's identity might be false or misleading. Her decision to confront David directly about the inconsistencies in his professional claims represented both courage and determination to understand the truth about someone she had believed she knew and trusted. The conversation she planned would require careful preparation and emotional strength, given the potential for discovering that their entire relationship had been built on false foundations. The days leading up to Rachel's planned confrontation with David were filled with anxiety and careful strategizing about how to approach such a sensitive and potentially relationship-ending conversation. Rachel struggled with questions about whether to present her evidence gradually or demand immediate explanations for all the discrepancies she had discovered. The possibility that David might have reasonable explanations for the apparent inconsistencies competed with growing certainty that she had been deliberately deceived about fundamental aspects of his identity and career. As Rachel prepared for what might be the most important conversation of their relationship, neither of us could have imagined that David's professional deceptions were actually part of something much larger and more serious than simple misrepresentation about consulting work. The truth about David's real identity and the reasons for his elaborate professional facade would soon be revealed in ways that would transform our understanding of his presence in our family and his relationship with Rachel from a romantic deception into something that would involve federal law enforcement and have consequences that extended far beyond personal heartbreak. The confrontation Rachel had been planning took an unexpected turn when David arrived at her downtown loft office unannounced on the Tuesday morning after New Year's, carrying coffee and wearing the kind of serious expression that suggested he had important news to share. Rachel had spent the weekend rehearsing how she would present her discoveries about his fabricated consulting business and false client references. But David's unexpected visit disrupted her carefully planned approach, to addressing the deceptions she had uncovered through her investigation. David's demeanor that morning was different from his usual relaxed confidence, carrying an urgency that Rachel initially interpreted as work-related stress, but which would later prove to be something far more significant. He explained that his consulting project schedules had changed unexpectedly, requiring him to travel more frequently over the coming months and potentially limiting his availability for the social and business events that had become an important part of their shared routine. The timing of this announcement, coming just as Rachel had begun questioning the legitimacy of his professional claims, felt suspicious in ways that heightened her determination to demand honest answers about his real work. Rachel's response to David's news about increased travel demands provided the opening she needed to begin addressing the inconsistencies she had discovered in his professional background. Instead of expressing understanding about his work obligations, as she might have done in previous conversations, Rachel began asking specific questions about his client base, project timelines, and the nature of the consulting work that required such frequent travel. Her questions were pointed and persistent, reflecting her growing certainty that David's explanations about his career contained fundamental deceptions that needed to be exposed and addressed. David's reaction to Rachel's detailed questioning revealed a level of discomfort that confirmed her suspicions about the legitimacy of his professional claims. His responses became increasingly vague and evasive as Rachel pressed for specific information about client names, project deliverables, and the business registration details that should have been easily accessible for any legitimate consulting operation. When Rachel directly mentioned her unsuccessful attempts to find online evidence of his consulting business, David's expression shifted from mild annoyance to something approaching alarm. The conversation escalated when Rachel presented the specific evidence she had gathered about David's false professional claims, including the hotel's denial that they had engaged his consulting services and the absence of any business registration for his described company. David's initial attempt to explain these discrepancies as misunderstandings or administrative oversights became increasingly implausible as Rachel systematically addressed each inconsistency with documentation and verification from multiple sources. His discomfort with her investigative thoroughness suggested someone who was unaccustomed to having his professional claims subjected to detailed scrutiny. What surprised Rachel most about David's response to her confrontation was his apparent resignation rather than anger or defensive justification. Instead of continuing to maintain his false explanations or becoming upset about her investigation into his background, David seemed to deflate as the weight of his deceptions became impossible to sustain. His expression carried a mixture of relief and apprehension that suggested he had been expecting this confrontation and was perhaps even grateful that the burden of maintaining false professional identity was finally being challenged. David's admission that his consulting business was not entirely what he had represented marked the beginning of a conversation that would transform Rachel's understanding of their relationship while raising new questions about his true identity and motivations. He explained that his work situation was complicated in ways that made it difficult to provide the kind of straightforward professional descriptions that most people expected, but his explanations remained frustratingly vague about the specific nature of his actual employment and the reasons for his elaborate deceptions about consulting work. When Rachel demanded more specific information about David's real job and the reasons for his misrepresentations, his responses revealed layers of complexity that she had never suspected during their months of dating. David explained that his work involved sensitive business analysis and investigation that required discretion about client relationships and project details, making it easier to describe his activities in general terms rather than providing specifics that might compromise professional confidentiality. His explanations suggested work in corporate intelligence or business investigation, rather than traditional management consulting, though he remained evasive about his actual employer and specific job responsibilities. Rachel's frustration with David's continued vagueness about his real work prompted her to demand complete honesty about his professional identity and the extent of his deceptions about their relationship. She pointed out that his willingness to lie about fundamental aspects of his career called into question every other aspect of his character and their shared experiences, making it impossible for her to trust any information he provided without independent verification. Her anger was justified and articulate, expressing betrayal about the deceptions while demanding accountability for the false foundation their relationship had been built upon. David's response to Rachel's demand for complete transparency revealed the depth of his internal conflict about maintaining his professional cover while preserving their personal relationship. He admitted that his attraction to Rachel and their developing relationship had created complications he hadn't anticipated when they first met, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the professional deceptions that his work required. His genuine affection for Rachel was evident, but it was now overshadowed by the revelation that their entire relationship had been compromised by his inability to be honest about his real identity and career. The conversation took another dramatic turn when David explained that his work situation was about to change in ways that would affect both his availability for their relationship and his ability to maintain his current living arrangements in the Columbus area. He described his current assignment as reaching a critical phase that would require increased time commitment and potentially different professional responsibilities, though he remained frustratingly unclear about what type of work required such dramatic lifestyle changes. Rachel's questions about whether his job involved law enforcement or government work were met with responses that neither confirmed nor denied these possibilities. Rachel's growing suspicion that David might work in law enforcement was reinforced by several details about his behavior and knowledge that she had noticed, but never fully considered during their relationship. His familiarity with legal procedures and regulatory requirements, his comfort with questioning people about their business practices, and his tendency to ask detailed questions about financial management and record-keeping now seemed potentially related to professional rather than casual interest in these topics. The possibility that David was involved in some form of investigation or enforcement work would explain both his knowledge base and his need for professional discretion. The most disturbing aspect of Rachel's realization about David's possible law enforcement background was the implications for their relationship and his interest in her business activities. Rachel's event planning company had grown rapidly over the past few years, with cash-heavy transactions and complex vendor relationships that might attract regulatory attention from tax authorities or business compliance investigators. The possibility that David's romantic interest in her had been motivated by professional investigation rather than genuine attraction created a level of betrayal that went far beyond simple lying about consulting work. David's response to Rachel's direct questions about whether their relationship was connected to any investigation of her business was careful and evasive in ways that heightened rather than alleviated her concerns. His assurances that his feelings for her were genuine and that their relationship had developed independently of his work responsibilities felt inadequate given the context of his previous deceptions and the potential implications of law enforcement. Interest in her business activities. Rachel's demand for complete honesty about his motivations and the true nature of their relationship remained unresolved as David continued to balance professional obligations against personal disclosure. The conversation was interrupted by David's phone ringing with what he described as an urgent work call that required his immediate attention. His request to step outside for privacy while taking the call felt familiar from previous occasions, but now carried new significance given Rachel's suspicions about his real profession and the possibility that their relationship was connected to official business rather than romantic interest. When David returned from his phone conversation, his expression suggested that developments in his work situation had reached a point where continued secrecy would be impossible to maintain. David's explanation of his phone conversation revealed that his current assignment was approaching conclusion in ways that would soon make his professional identity and activities a matter of public record. He warned Rachel that she might be contacted by law enforcement officials in the coming days for what he described as routine questions related to his work, though he remained vague about the specific nature of the investigation and Rachel's potential connection to whatever case he was involved in. His tone carried genuine concern for Rachel's emotional well-being and reputation, suggesting that whatever was about to be revealed would be significant and potentially disruptive. Rachel's reaction to David's warning about potential law enforcement contact was a mixture of fear, anger, and determination to understand the full extent of her involvement in whatever investigation David had been conducting. Her questions about whether she was a target of investigation or simply a witness to activities involving other people were met with assurances that she was not in legal jeopardy, but David's explanations remained insufficient to address her concerns about how extensively her life and business had been scrutinized as part of his professional activities. The possibility that David had been investigating Rachel's business practices while maintaining an intimate personal relationship with her represented a violation of trust that went beyond romantic deception into professional and legal territory that Rachel had never imagined confronting. Her event planning business had always operated within legal boundaries, but the complex financial arrangements involved in high-end event coordination could potentially appear suspicious to investigators unfamiliar with industry practices. Rachel's concern about how her business activities might be interpreted by law enforcement officials was compounded by uncertainty about what information David had gathered and reported during their months of dating. David's attempt to reassure Rachel about her legal position and the limited scope of any potential law enforcement interest in her activities was undermined by his continued inability to provide specific information about the investigation he was involved in and her connection to whatever case was reaching conclusion. His explanations that she would understand everything within a few days felt inadequate given the immediate impact his revelations were having on her sense of security and trust in their relationship. Rachel's demand for immediate answers about the investigation and her involvement was met with repeated explanations about professional obligations and confidentiality requirements that prevented complete disclosure. The emotional toll of discovering that her relationship with David had been compromised by professional deceptions and potential law enforcement investigation was evident in Rachel's increasingly agitated response to his attempts at reassurance and explanation. Her anger about the violations of trust and privacy was justified and growing, particularly as she began to understand that intimate details of her personal and professional life had likely been scrutinized and documented as part of whatever investigation David was conducting. The realization that their romantic relationship had provided David with access to information and connections that might be relevant to official business felt like a fundamental betrayal of intimacy and trust. David's visible conflict between his professional obligations and his personal feelings for Rachel was genuine, but insufficient to address the damage his deceptions had caused to their relationship and Rachel's sense of security. His explanations that he had tried to maintain separation between his work responsibilities and their personal relationship felt inadequate, given the extensive integration of their social and professional lives over the months they had been dating. Rachel's network of business contacts and clients had been exposed to David through their shared social activities, creating potential professional liability that she had never consented to or been informed about. The conversation concluded with David's reluctant admission that his assignment would likely become public knowledge within days, making continued secrecy about his professional identity impossible to maintain. His warning that Rachel should prepare for media attention and potential disruption to her business activities suggested that whatever investigation he was involved in had significant scope and public interest. Rachel's realization that her association with David might result in unwanted scrutiny of her business and personal life represented another layer of consequences from his deceptions that extended far beyond their romantic relationship. As David prepared to leave Rachel's office, his expression carried genuine regret about the pain his professional obligations had caused to their relationship, and his hope that she would eventually understand the constraints he had been operating under during their time together. His request that Rachel avoid discussing their conversation or his revelations with other people until the official conclusion of his assignment felt like another attempt to control information and manage outcomes, though his concern seemed focused on protecting Rachel from additional complications rather than preserving his own professional position. Rachel's emotional state after David's departure was a complex mixture of betrayal, fear, and angry determination to understand the full extent of how her trust had been violated and her life had been affected by his professional deceptions. Her immediate priority was assessing the potential impact on her business and reputation from whatever law enforcement investigation was about to become public, though the limited information David had provided made it impossible to prepare adequately for developments that remained largely unknown. The conversation had answered some questions about David's mysterious professional background, while raising far more serious concerns about the implications for Rachel's future. The days following David's revelations were filled with anxiety and speculation as Rachel waited for the law enforcement contact he had warned about while trying to maintain normal business operations, despite her growing concern about potential scrutiny of her company's activities. Her attempts to research what types of investigations might involve the kind of undercover work David seemed to be describing provided limited useful information, though the possibilities ranged from tax enforcement to organized crime investigation, in ways that made it impossible to predict what she might be facing. Rachel's decision to consult with a business attorney about the potential legal implications of her situation represented the first step in protecting herself from whatever consequences might result from her unwitting involvement in David's professional activities. The attorney's questions about her business practices and financial record-keeping helped Rachel understand what aspects of her operations might attract regulatory attention, though the lack of specific information about the investigation made it difficult to prepare targeted responses to potential official inquiries. The waiting period also prompted Rachel to review her business relationships and financial arrangements with new scrutiny, trying to identify any practices or connections that might appear suspicious to law enforcement investigators unfamiliar with event planning industry standards. Her growing awareness of how normal business activities could be misinterpreted by outsiders created additional stress, as she realized that David's access to detailed information about her operations had provided investigators with comprehensive insight into every aspect of her professional life. As the week progressed without the promised law enforcement contact materializing, Rachel's anxiety about David's warnings began to compete with anger about his continued manipulation of her emotions and circumstances through incomplete information and vague threats about future developments. The possibility that his dramatic revelations about impending official contact had been exaggerated or misrepresented felt consistent with his previous deceptions, though the risk of being unprepared for serious legal developments made it impossible to dismiss his warnings entirely. The uncertainty about David's true professional identity and the scope of whatever investigation he was involved in created a state of suspended anxiety that made it difficult for Rachel to focus on normal business activities or personal relationships. Her growing isolation from friends and family, driven by David's warnings about discussing their conversation, compounded the emotional stress of dealing with potential legal complications while managing the betrayal and loss of trust in their romantic relationship. The realization that David's deceptions had created consequences that extended far beyond personal heartbreak was becoming increasingly apparent as the full implications of his revelations continued to unfold. My world shifted dramatically when Rachel called me at 7 a.m, 3 days after her confrontation with David, her voice shaking with a combination of terror and rage that immediately jolted me awake. 2 federal agents had arrived at her downtown loft office before she had even finished her first cup of coffee, presenting badges and credentials that identified them as investigators from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They had politely but firmly requested her cooperation in what they described as an ongoing federal investigation into financial crimes, though their initial questions had been surprisingly focused on her business record-keeping practices, rather than any connection to David's mysterious work. Rachel's description of the federal agent's visit revealed a level of official scrutiny that went far beyond the routine business inquiry David had suggested she might face during their difficult conversation. Special Agent Martinez and Special Agent Thompson had arrived with detailed knowledge of Elegance Events' financial structure, client relationships, and operational procedures that could only have been gathered through extensive investigation of her business activities. Their questions demonstrated familiarity with specific transactions, vendor arrangements, and client payments that suggested months of careful analysis of her company's financial records and business practices. The most disturbing aspect of the agent's questioning involved detailed inquiries about cash transactions and payment processing methods that Rachel had implemented to accommodate her high-end clientele's preferences for privacy and discretion. The event planning industry regularly involved large cash payments for services like catering, entertainment, and venue deposits, particularly when clients wanted to avoid extensive paper trails for personal or business reasons. What Rachel had always considered standard industry practices were now being examined as potentially suspicious financial activities that might violate federal tax reporting requirements. Agent Martinez had been particularly interested in Rachel's relationships with certain vendors and service providers who specialized in luxury event services for wealthy clients seeking maximum privacy and minimal documentation. These vendor relationships had been cultivated carefully over years of business development, representing valuable professional connections that enabled Rachel to offer the kind of exclusive services that justified her premium pricing structure. The agent's question suggested that some of these vendor relationships might be under federal investigation for tax evasion or other financial crimes that Rachel had never suspected or been aware of. The revelation that federal investigators had been monitoring Rachel's business activities for an extended period created a retroactive sense of violation that went beyond her recent discovery of David's professional deceptions. Every business meeting, client consultation, and vendor negotiation over the past months had apparently been subject to potential surveillance and documentation by federal law enforcement officials. The realization that her professional communications and financial transactions had been scrutinized as part of a criminal investigation felt like a fundamental invasion of privacy and business autonomy that she had never consented to or been informed about. Rachel's most immediate concern involved the potential impact of federal investigation on her business reputation and client relationships, particularly given the exclusive nature of her clientele and their expectations of complete discretion. Regarding their event planning and entertainment preferences, many of her highest-paying clients were prominent business leaders and wealthy individuals who valued privacy above all other considerations when planning personal celebrations or corporate events. The possibility that their association with elegance events might expose them to federal scrutiny or unwanted attention could result in immediate cancellation of contracts and permanent damage to her professional reputation. The agents had been careful to emphasize that Rachel was not currently considered a target of their investigation, describing her instead as a potential witness who might possess information relevant to their inquiry into broader patterns of financial misconduct within the luxury service industry. Their assurances that cooperation with their investigation would be viewed favorably felt ominous rather than reassuring, suggesting that Rachel's future legal status might depend on her willingness to provide information about clients and vendors who might be involved in activities she had never questioned or investigated. When Rachel asked directly whether the federal investigation was connected to David's presence in her life and their romantic relationship, Agent Thompson's response had been diplomatically evasive in ways that confirmed her worst suspicions about the violation of trust and privacy she had experienced. The agents acknowledged that they were aware of her relationship with David, but declined to provide specific information about his role in their investigation or the extent to which their romantic involvement had been monitored or documented as part of official law enforcement activities. The suggestion that Rachel's intimate relationship with David had been subject to federal surveillance and analysis represented a level of personal violation that went far beyond professional deception into territory that felt fundamentally wrong, regardless of whatever crimes the investigation was intended to address. The possibility that private conversations, personal activities, and romantic interactions had been observed or recorded as part of David's undercover work created a sense of betrayal that made their relationship's romantic deceptions seem minor, by comparison to the institutional violation of privacy and autonomy she had unknowingly experienced. Rachel's demand for information about the scope and duration of surveillance involving her personal life was met with standard responses about ongoing investigations and confidentiality requirements that prevented detailed disclosure of investigative methods or timelines. The agent's professional courtesy could not disguise the fact that Rachel's privacy and autonomy had been compromised in ways that would have lasting psychological and emotional consequences, regardless of whatever legal protections existed for people in her situation as potential witnesses rather than investigation targets. The meeting with federal agents concluded with instructions for Rachel to continue normal business operations, while avoiding any actions that might appear to obstruct their investigation or warn potential targets about the ongoing federal scrutiny of industry practices. Their guidance about maintaining routine business activities felt impossible to follow, given Rachel's new awareness that every transaction and communication might be monitored and analyzed for evidence of criminal activity she had never intended or been aware of participating in. The emotional aftermath of discovering that her business and personal life had been under federal investigation while she believed she was simply building a successful company and enjoying a romantic relationship was devastating in ways that Rachel struggled to articulate when she called me for support and guidance. The violation of trust extended beyond David's personal deceptions to include institutional betrayal by law enforcement agencies that had monitored her private life without her knowledge or consent as part of investigating crimes she had no awareness of committing or participating in. Rachel's immediate priorities involved protecting her business from the potential damage of federal investigation while attempting to understand the scope of her legal exposure and the actions she needed to take to ensure her cooperation with law enforcement would be viewed favorably by investigators and prosecutors. Her consultation with a criminal defense attorney revealed the serious nature of federal tax evasion investigations and the potential consequences for businesses and individuals who were found to have violated federal reporting requirements, even unknowingly or through industry practices they had believed were legal and appropriate. The attorney's explanation of federal sentencing guidelines for tax evasion and related financial crimes provided sobering context for Rachel's situation and the importance of complete cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The possibility of criminal charges, substantial financial penalties, and permanent damage to her professional reputation made it clear that Rachel's immediate future would be defined by her ability to navigate federal legal proceedings while preserving whatever remained of her business and personal relationships after the investigation concluded. Most disturbing for Rachel was the realization that her extensive client base and vendor network might be similarly unaware of their involvement in whatever federal investigation had encompassed her business activities. The possibility that her professional relationships had unknowingly exposed clients and business partners to federal scrutiny created potential liability for damage to other people's reputations and legal standing that went far beyond her own personal consequences from the investigation. The criminal defense attorney's advice about limiting communications with clients and vendors while the investigation remained active felt like professional suicide for a business that depended entirely on personal relationships and reputation for referrals and repeat business. Rachel's dilemma involved balancing legal prudence against business survival in ways that made it impossible to maintain normal operations while protecting herself from potential criminal liability or charges of obstruction of justice. Rachel's growing understanding of the federal investigation's scope and potential consequences prompted her to reach out to me not just for emotional support, but for practical assistance in managing the crisis that her life and business had suddenly become. Her request for help in reviewing her financial records and business practices reflected both trust in my analytical capabilities and desperation about her ability to understand and address the complex legal and business challenges she was facing without professional guidance and family support. My own emotional response to Rachel's crisis involved a complicated mixture of sympathy for her situation and lingering resentment about the condescending treatment I had received during our family vacation, though it quickly became clear that her current legal jeopardy far outweighed any personal grievances about past behavior. The practical reality of federal criminal investigation and potential prosecution created stakes that demanded family solidarity and mutual support, regardless of previous relationship dynamics or hurt feelings about David's romantic choices. The process of reviewing Rachel's business records and financial documentation revealed the complexity of luxury event planning operations and the legitimate business reasons for many of the cash transactions and vendor relationships that had apparently attracted federal attention. Rachel's record-keeping was meticulous and professional, though the nature of her industry created patterns of financial activity that could appear suspicious to investigators unfamiliar with the operational requirements of high-end event coordination and the privacy preferences of wealthy clientele. What became increasingly apparent through detailed review of Rachel's business practices was that her operations fell within legal boundaries, but operated in areas of tax law and financial reporting that were complex enough to create potential exposure if federal prosecutors chose to interpret her activities unfavorably, or if any of her vendors or clients had engaged in criminal activities that Rachel was unaware of or uninvolved in. The possibility that legitimate business practices could be recharacterized as criminal activity, depending on prosecutorial discretion and investigative findings, created a level of legal uncertainty that was terrifying for someone who had always operated within established industry standards. Rachel's vendor relationships, which had been a source of professional pride and competitive advantage for her business, now represented potential legal liability depending on whether any of those vendors had engaged in tax evasion or other financial crimes that federal investigators had discovered. The interconnected nature of the luxury service industry meant that Rachel's business success had been built on relationships with people whose own legal and financial practices she had never investigated or questioned beyond normal business due diligence requirements. The most troubling discovery during our review of Rachel's business operations involved several large cash transactions with vendors who provided specialized services for clients, requiring maximum discretion and privacy. These transactions had been properly documented and reported according to Rachel's understanding of tax requirements, but the amounts and frequency of cash payments had created a pattern that might appear suspicious to federal investigators looking for evidence of money laundering or tax evasion schemes within the luxury service industry. Rachel's growing panic about the potential reinterpretation of legitimate business activities as criminal behavior reflected the reality that federal prosecutors had significant discretionary power in determining whether to file charges and what charges to pursue based on the same set of facts and business practices. The possibility that her cooperation with the ongoing investigation might not be sufficient to protect her from prosecution created a level of anxiety that made it difficult for Rachel to think clearly about her legal strategy and business preservation options. The emotional toll of simultaneous betrayal by David and investigation by federal law enforcement was evident in Rachel's deteriorating ability to maintain normal personal and professional routines while managing the crisis that her life had become. Her sleep deprivation, loss of appetite, and increasing social isolation reflected the psychological impact of discovering that fundamental assumptions about her business, relationships, and legal security had been false or compromised in ways that threatened everything she had worked to build over the past decade. Rachel's decision to temporarily suspend most of her business operations while the federal investigation remained active represented a devastating blow to years of professional development and relationship building, though her attorney's advice made it clear that continued normal operations might create additional legal exposure or appearance of obstruction that could worsen her situation. The choice between maintaining business relationships and protecting legal interests felt impossible given the lack of clear guidance about what activities were acceptable during an ongoing federal investigation. My role in supporting Rachel through this crisis required setting aside personal feelings about our relationship history and David's romantic choices in favor of family loyalty and practical assistance during a genuine emergency that threatened her freedom and financial survival. The seriousness of federal criminal investigation created perspective about the relative importance of personal grievances compared to protecting family members from life-altering legal consequences and potential incarceration. The waiting period, while federal investigators continued their work and prepared potential charges or plea agreements, felt interminable as Rachel's anxiety about her legal exposure competed with growing anger about David's role in creating her current situation. Through his undercover work and romantic deceptions, the combination of personal betrayal and potential criminal prosecution created a level of stress that was difficult to manage even with family support and professional legal representation. As January progressed without resolution of the federal investigation or clear guidance about Rachel's legal status, the uncertainty about her future began to affect our entire family's emotional well-being and holiday traditions. The possibility that Rachel might face criminal charges created a shadow over family gatherings and conversations that made it difficult to maintain normal relationships and activities, while everyone waited for developments that might change our family dynamics permanently. The most difficult aspect of supporting Rachel through the federal investigation was the limited information available about the scope of the case, the timeline for resolution, and the specific evidence or allegations that had prompted such extensive scrutiny of her business activities. The lack of clear understanding about what Rachel was accused of or suspected of made it impossible to develop effective responses or prepare adequate defenses against charges that remained undefined and unpredictable. The phone call that would finally expose the truth about David's identity came on a frigid Tuesday morning in late January, when Agent Martinez contacted Rachel to request her presence at a federal courthouse in Columbus for what she described as a significant development in the investigation that would require Rachel's immediate attention and cooperation. The formal tone of the agent's voice suggested that whatever was about to unfold represented a major escalation in the case that had already turned Rachel's life upside down, though the lack of specific details made it impossible to prepare for what might be the most important day of her legal proceedings. Rachel's criminal defense attorney accompanied her to the federal courthouse, where they were directed to a conference room that contained more law enforcement officials than Rachel had ever seen assembled in one place. The presence of agents from multiple federal agencies, including the FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and U.S. Attorney's Office, suggested that the investigation Rachel had been caught up in was far more extensive and significant than the business compliance inquiry she had initially believed she was facing. The serious expressions and formal demeanor of the assembled officials created an atmosphere of gravity that made it clear this meeting would fundamentally change Rachel's understanding of her situation. The lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, began the meeting by explaining that the investigation Rachel had been involved in as a potential witness had reached its conclusion with the successful completion of an 18-month undercover operation targeting a sophisticated tax evasion and money laundering scheme operating within Ohio's luxury service industry. The scope of the criminal enterprise that had been uncovered included multiple businesses and individuals who had been systematically underreporting income, falsifying business expenses, and laundering money through complex networks of cash-based service providers who catered to wealthy clients seeking to minimize their tax obligations through illegal means. Rachel's initial relief at learning that the investigation had concluded quickly transformed into shock when Attorney Walsh explained that the undercover operation had been conducted by FBI Special Agent David Chen, whose romantic relationship with Rachel had provided crucial access to the network of vendors and service providers that had enabled the criminal enterprise to operate undetected for several years. The revelation that David was an FBI agent rather than a business consultant created a moment of stunning cognitive dissonance as Rachel processed the implications of having been romantically involved with a federal law enforcement officer who had been investigating her business and professional relationships. The explanation of David's undercover role revealed the sophisticated nature of the FBI operation and the extent to which Rachel's personal and professional life had been monitored and analyzed as part of gathering evidence against the primary targets of the investigation. David's assignment had been to infiltrate the luxury service industry through romantic and professional relationships that would provide access to the cash-based transactions and vendor networks that federal investigators suspected were being used to facilitate tax evasion and money laundering activities among Ohio's wealthy business and social elite. Attorney Walsh's description of the evidence gathered during the undercover operation included detailed documentation of financial transactions, vendor relationships, and business practices that had been observed and recorded through David's access to Rachel's professional activities and social connections. The breadth of information that had been collected during their relationship was staggering, encompassing virtually every aspect of Rachel's business operations and personal life over the months they had been dating. The realization that intimate conversations, business meetings, and private activities had been subject to federal surveillance and documentation created a sense of violation that went far beyond romantic betrayal. The most shocking revelation came when Attorney Walsh explained that Rachel was not being charged with any criminal activity, as the investigation had determined that her business practices, while operating in areas that attracted the attention of tax evaders and money launderers, had remained within legal boundaries and had actually helped federal investigators understand how legitimate businesses could unknowingly become involved in criminal schemes. Rachel's meticulous record-keeping and transparent business practices had served as a contrast to the deliberately opaque operations of the investigation's actual targets, providing evidence of how the luxury service industry was supposed to function versus how it was being exploited by criminal enterprises. The primary targets of the investigation included several of Rachel's vendors and 3 of her high-profile clients, who had been using luxury event services as a mechanism for laundering money and evading taxes through deliberately complex payment schemes that involved multiple business entities and cash transactions designed to obscure the true sources and destinations of significant sums of money. These individuals had been arrested in coordinated raids that morning, with evidence gathered through David's undercover work, providing the foundation for criminal charges that included tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Rachel's role in the successful prosecution of these cases was described as crucial but unwitting, as her legitimate business operations had provided the perfect cover for David's investigation, while her honest business practices had helped federal prosecutors demonstrate the contrast between legal industry operations and the criminal activities they were pursuing. The irony that Rachel's success and reputation in the luxury service industry had made her the ideal, unwitting partner for an undercover investigation targeting criminal activities within that same industry was not lost on anyone in the room. The emotional impact of learning that her romantic relationship with David had been fundamentally deceptive, while simultaneously being essential to a major federal investigation, created a complex mixture of betrayal, pride, and confusion that Rachel struggled to process while surrounded by law enforcement officials and legal representatives. The validation that her business practices were legitimate and had actually aided in prosecuting criminals provided some relief, but it could not address the personal violation of having been unknowingly involved in an intimate relationship with someone whose primary motivation had been professional rather than romantic. Attorney Walsh's explanation that David's feelings for Rachel had created significant complications for the undercover operation and had required careful management by FBI supervisors provided some context for the genuine emotion and conflict that Rachel had observed during their relationship, particularly during his final conversation, when he had seemed torn between professional obligations and personal attachment. The revelation that David had requested permission to disclose his true identity to Rachel earlier in their relationship, only to be denied by FBI leadership who feared compromising the investigation, suggested that his romantic feelings had been authentic even within the context of professional deception. The presence of FBI Special Agent Sarah Collins, David's partner and supervisor during the undercover operation, provided additional perspective on the ethical complexities and emotional challenges of conducting long-term undercover investigations that required agents to develop genuine personal relationships while maintaining professional objectivity and operational security. Agent Collins explained that David's assignment had been particularly difficult because of the romantic nature of his cover relationship and the genuine attachment he had developed to Rachel, despite the professional requirements of his undercover role. The debriefing process that followed included detailed questions about Rachel's observations of her vendors and clients during the period of David's undercover work, as federal prosecutors prepared for trials that would require her testimony. About business practices and financial transactions she had witnessed or participated in as part of her legitimate event planning operations. Rachel's cooperation would be essential for explaining industry standards and normal business practices to juries who would need to understand the difference between legal operations and the criminal activities being prosecuted. The most difficult aspect of Rachel's debriefing involved reviewing recorded conversations and documented interactions that had been captured during David's undercover work, including private moments and intimate conversations that she had believed were confidential between romantic partners. The necessity of using this evidence in criminal prosecutions meant that aspects of Rachel's personal life would become part of public court records, creating ongoing consequences for her privacy and reputation that extended far beyond the conclusion of the investigation. Rachel's questions about David's current whereabouts and his desire to communicate with her were met with explanations about witness protection protocols and the ongoing security concerns that surrounded high-profile federal prosecutions involving organized criminal enterprises. The possibility that Rachel might be able to speak with David again depended on the conclusion of the criminal trials and the assessment of security risks by federal marshals responsible for protecting witnesses and undercover agents whose identities had been compromised through their investigative work. The legal proceedings that followed would require Rachel's testimony in multiple criminal trials over the course of several months, as federal prosecutors sought to obtain convictions against the various individuals and business entities that had been charged as a result of the undercover investigation. Rachel's role as a government witness would provide some legal protection, but would also require her to relive the personal betrayal and professional disruption she had experienced, while helping to ensure that justice was served against those who had exploited the luxury service industry for criminal purposes. The financial impact of the investigation on Rachel's business was significant, but not devastating, as many of her legitimate clients and vendors remained available for future work once the criminal prosecutions were resolved and the taint of federal investigation had been removed from her professional reputation. The publicity surrounding the case actually enhanced Rachel's credibility within the industry, as her cooperation with federal investigators and the validation of her ethical business practices distinguished her from competitors who might be operating in legally questionable areas. The personal healing process for Rachel involved months of therapy and family support as she worked to process the complex emotions surrounding her relationship with David and her unwitting involvement in a major federal investigation. The violation of trust and privacy was balanced against the knowledge that her experiences had contributed to protecting other potential victims of the criminal enterprise and ensuring that tax evaders and money launderers faced appropriate legal consequences for their actions. My own role in supporting Rachel through the aftermath of the investigation involved setting aside my previous resentments about her condescending behavior and David's romantic choices in favor of family solidarity during a genuinely traumatic experience that had challenged her assumptions about relationships, business, and personal security. The perspective provided by Rachel's crisis helped our entire family understand the relative importance of personal grievances compared to supporting each other through genuine emergencies and life-changing events. The resolution of the criminal cases provided closure for Rachel's legal involvement in the investigation, while leaving unresolved questions about her future relationship possibilities with David and the long-term impact of their undercover romance on both of their emotional well-being. The letters that David had been permitted to send through FBI channels expressed genuine regret about the deception and personal pain caused by his professional obligations, while also conveying authentic feelings that had developed despite the Artificial circumstances of their initial meeting and relationship development. Rachel's decision about whether to pursue contact with David after the conclusion of his witness protection protocols represented a complex choice between forgiveness and self-protection, as the possibility of rebuilding a relationship with someone who had been professionally required to deceive her carried both romantic potential and psychological risks that were difficult to evaluate. The genuine emotions that had existed within their deceptive relationship created the possibility of authentic connection, but the foundation of lies and professional manipulation made it challenging to determine whether rebuilding trust was possible or advisable. The media attention surrounding the federal prosecutions brought unexpected recognition to Rachel's business as an example of ethical practices within an industry that had been exploited by criminal enterprises. Though the association with high-profile criminal cases also created challenges in attracting new clients who preferred to avoid any connection to federal investigations or legal proceedings. Rachel's navigation of these professional consequences required careful public relations management and strategic business development that emphasized her cooperation with law enforcement and her commitment to transparent operations. The family dynamics that emerged after the resolution of the investigation included new appreciation for Rachel's strength and resilience in handling an unprecedented crisis while maintaining her ethical standards and family relationships despite enormous personal and professional pressure. The condescending behavior that had characterized her interactions during our family vacation seemed trivial compared to the grace and dignity she had displayed while facing potential criminal charges and the destruction of everything she had worked to build. The long-term impact of Rachel's experience with federal investigation and undercover romance influenced her approach to future relationships and business partnerships, creating heightened awareness of the importance of transparency and verification in both personal and professional contexts. The hard-learned lessons about trust and deception shaped her decision-making processes while also providing valuable insights that enhanced her ability to evaluate people and situations with appropriate skepticism and careful analysis. The conclusion of the criminal trials in the fall brought final resolution to Rachel's legal obligations as a government witness, while opening possibilities for renewed contact with David through carefully managed communications that would allow them to explore whether their relationship could survive the revelation of his true identity and professional obligations. The letters and phone calls that followed suggested that genuine feelings had existed within their deceptive relationship, creating hope for authentic connection built on complete honesty rather than undercover necessity. The wedding invitation that arrived the following spring provided the ultimate resolution to the complex story of Rachel's relationship with FBI Special Agent David Chen, as they had chosen to rebuild their romance on a foundation of complete transparency and mutual understanding of the professional obligations that had initially brought them together through deception. Their decision to marry represented both forgiveness and faith in the possibility of authentic love, emerging from even the most complicated and ethically challenging circumstances. The ceremony itself was attended by both families and the FBI, colleagues who had supported David through the emotional challenges of his undercover assignment, creating a unique celebration that acknowledged both the personal happiness of the couple and the professional success of the investigation that had brought them together. Rachel's wedding speech included gracious acknowledgement of the pain and confusion caused by the deception, while expressing gratitude for the ultimate honesty and justice that had emerged from the complex circumstances of their relationship. My own reflection on the entire experience included new appreciation for the complexity of human relationships and the possibility of finding authentic connection even within circumstances that involve significant deception and betrayal. Rachel's journey from condescending sister to federal witness to happy bride provided perspective on personal growth and the importance of supporting family members through challenges that test fundamental assumptions about trust, identity, and the nature of love itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.